He laid flowers on her grave for 3 years. 3 years believing the fire had taken the only woman who ever made a mafia boss's heart beat like a human being's. 3 years building an empire out of grief and silence and something that used to be love but cured itself into something much colder. Then one night, rain on the highway, a radio station nobody listens to, her voice came through the speaker. Not a memory, not a ghost. Serena Vale was alive, and someone had lied to him. If you love stories about betrayal, obsession, and a love that refuses to die, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me know how far this story has traveled. Don't skip a single second. The radio station broadcast out of a converted garage somewhere in the Illinois flatlands, WKRN 94.7, the kind of outfit that played old country between farm reports and ran public interest segments nobody listened to except insomniacs and long-haul truckers grinding through dead-of-night highway miles with nowhere better to be. Cassian Voss had never heard of it before that night. He would never forget it after. He was driving alone, which was unusual enough that his security detail had spent 10 minutes trying to talk him out of it. Marcus, his head of personal protection, had planted himself in the doorway of the Dearborn safe house with his arms crossed and his jaw set and said, "Boss, 2 cars minimum. You know the protocol." And Cassian had looked at him with the particular kind of stillness that meant the conversation was already over, and said, "Stay here," and walked past him to the Escalade without another word. He needed the silence. He needed the empty highway and the rain and nothing else. No voices, no reports, no one watching him from the corner of their eye waiting to read his mood and calibrate their behavior accordingly. That was the exhausting part nobody talked about, the part that wore at him in ways that bullets and threats never had. Being read constantly, being performed at. Every person in his orbit angled toward him like they were plants, and he was the only light source in the room, which meant nobody ever just talked to him like he was a person. They talked at the position he occupied. They talked at what he could do to them, or for them. Nobody talked to Cassian Voss anymore. They addressed him. It was close to midnight. The storm had rolled in off Lake Michigan 2 hours before, and it was bad enough that the highway was nearly empty. Just the occasional semi grinding past in the opposite lane. Headlights blurred by the water sheeting across the windshield. Cassian drove at a steady 73 with both hands on the wheel, watching the wipers fight the rain, thinking about nothing. Thinking about nothing was the one discipline he had mastered in 3 years that actually helped. Not therapy. He'd tried that once, a discreet arrangement through a psychiatrist who specialized in high-risk occupations and kept his mouth shut. 3 sessions before Cassian stopped going because the man kept wanting to talk about feelings as though naming them accomplished something. Not alcohol. He drank occasionally, socially, never to blur anything. Just the deliberate practice of emptying out. Driving helped. Speed helped. Rain helped. He punched through the presets without purpose. Country station. Spanish language sports commentary. A preacher going hoarse. Static. More static. Then a woman's voice, mid-sentence, calm and specific, talking about water purification protocols in isolated coastal communities, and Cassian's hand stopped moving over the dial. His foot eased off the gas. The Escalade dropped from 73 to 60 to 40 without him making a conscious decision about it. The rain kept hammering. The woman kept talking, something about the difficulty of maintaining sterile conditions in a clinic without reliable electricity, about the improvisation required, about the patients who came in having driven 4 hours on unpaved roads because there was nowhere else. And Cassian's chest did something it had not done in 3 years. It tightened. Not pain exactly. More like something that had been floating loose inside him for a long time suddenly caught on something fixed and held. He recognized the voice before his mind processed what recognizing it meant. The particular lift at the end of her sentences. The way she paused before clinical terms. Not from uncertainty, but from the habit of making sure whoever was listening had stayed with her. The texture of it, low and unhurried, with that specific quality of attention in it, like she was always slightly more present than the situation required. He had fallen in love with that voice in a hospital waiting room 7 years ago when she was explaining a patient's chart to a colleague, and he was sitting 6 chairs away pretending to read a magazine. Not reading the magazine at all, just listening to her talk. The radio host asked her name. "Dr. Sarah Vance," she said. I've been with the outreach program for about 2 years now. Sarah Vance, not Serena Vale. Different name, same voice, and the difference in the name almost convinced him. Almost. He sat with the Escalade drifted to the highway shoulder, hazard lights strobing orange through the rain, and he pressed his fingers against his mouth and listened to the rest of the interview with the focused, terrible stillness of a man who has just heard something that threatens to undo 3 years of careful construction. When the segment ended and the station moved into a weather report, Cassian sat in the dark for a long time. Then he called Marcus. "I need you to find a radio station," he said, WKRN, somewhere in Illinois. "I need the recording of their midnight public interest segment from tonight. I need it in the next 2 hours. Silence on the other end. Then, "You okay, boss?" 2 hours, Marcus. He hung up, pulled back onto the highway, drove. The thing about grief, the thing nobody told you and that you had to discover on your own, usually at the worst possible moment, was that it built structure. 3 years of it had built Cassian a working architecture, a way of moving through days, a set of distances to keep between himself and anything soft enough to hurt him. He had built the distances carefully, the way you build something you intend to live in, and they had held. They had held through the expansion of the syndicate into 6 new cities, through the systematic elimination of every rival organization that had tried to move on his territory during what they assumed was his vulnerable period, the grief period, the period when a man's judgment goes sideways. He had not gone sideways. He had gone vertical. He had climbed so far above the grief that from the operational altitude he now occupied, looking down at the man who had spent 3 weeks unable to get out of bed after the warehouse fire felt like looking at a stranger. He had been so certain the architecture would hold. Now a woman's voice on a radio station nobody listened to had walked straight through it without even trying. Marcus called back in 90 minutes. He had the recording. He had also, because he was good at his job and had been with Cassian long enough to understand that a 2 a.m. request for a radio segment recording was not a casual inquiry, pulled the station's broadcast logs and confirmed the interview had aired live, not pre-recorded, which meant whoever had been sitting in that converted garage studio talking to the host had been physically present within driving distance of that Illinois Flatlands location at approximately 11:15 p.m. Cassian listened to the recording 4 times. He listened with his eyes closed and his hands flat on his knees, and the Escalade parked in the lot of a closed gas station somewhere outside Joliet, rain still going on the roof. He listened past the name. He listened past the content of what she was saying. He listened to the architecture of the voice itself. The breathing, the small hesitations, the way certain vowels opened slightly wider than average. A speech pattern he had cataloged without meaning to across years of conversations in kitchens and cars and hospital corridors, and the particular quality of dark that existed in a room when 2 people were almost asleep and talking quietly about nothing important. He had never told anyone what Serena Vale's voice sounded like. There was no recording of it he knew of, no voicemail saved, nothing he could have described precisely enough to manufacture doubt in another person. The certainty he felt was entirely his own, and entirely irrational and entirely unshakable. It was her. The question of how she could be alive. The warehouse fire had been investigated, the structural collapse confirmed, the forensic evidence processed, was a question he would answer later. The question of why she was using a different name was a question he would answer later. What he needed right now, sitting in a gas station parking lot outside Joliet at 2 a.m. with rain on the roof and 3 years of grief architecture crumbling around him, was a location. He told Marcus to trace the broadcast signal. He told him to find out everything about the outreach medical program Dr. Sarah Vance was associated with. He told him to do it quietly. No other members of the organization, just Marcus, personal capacity, no digital trail that moved through syndicate channels. Marcus said, "Cassian, what's happening?" It was the first time in 3 years Marcus had used his first name without the title. Cassian noted it without reacting to it. "Find the location," he said. "Call me when you have it." It took 4 days. 4 days during which Cassian ran his operations with the same cold precision he always did. Attended 2 meetings, approved 3 contracts, declined a sit-down request from a Detroit outfit that was testing boundaries, and slept approximately 6 hours total across all 4 nights. He didn't tell anyone what he was looking for or why. He ate meals at his desk. He answered every message within the hour. From the outside, nothing was different. On the inside, he was somewhere else entirely. Marcus called on the morning of the 5th day with a location. A coastal town called Mill Haven, population 4,200, situated on a stretch of shoreline 310 miles from Chicago. The outreach medical program operated a clinic out of a renovated building on the town's main road. Dr. Sarah Vance, licensed under that name in the state, the license issued 2.5 years ago, documentation consistent and properly filed, had been the clinic's primary physician for 22 months. 2.5 years, 6 months after the fire. Cassian looked at the address for a long time. "You want company?" Marcus asked. "No." Cassian. "No, Marcus." He drove to Mill Haven alone. It took 4.5 hours. He took back roads for the last 100 miles, avoiding the interstate, which was habit more than necessity, and he spent those 4.5 hours doing something he almost never allowed himself, which was thinking about the past. Specifically thinking about the 6 months before the fire, which had been the worst 6 months of their relationship and the period he had spent the most time not thinking about since, because the guilt attached to those months was the most corrosive kind, the kind that came from knowing you had been the problem and running out of time to fix it. They had been together for 2 years when it started going wrong. The syndicate was expanding, which meant Cassian was contracting, pulling inward, becoming less accessible, spending longer at the operations center, and fewer hours anywhere resembling a home. Serena had a surgical residency that kept her at the hospital for 36-hour stretches. So the practical reality was that they were two people who loved each other across a widening distance, meeting occasionally in the middle to confirm the other was still there, and then retreating back to their separate exhaustions. She had tried to talk about it. He had been bad at listening, not hostile. He was never hostile with her, which was the strange thing. She was the one person he could not sustain anger at, but absent. Present in body, absent in attention, running threat assessments in the back of his mind while she sat across the kitchen table trying to tell him something important. He knew she had been trying to tell him something important. He had not quite managed to hear it before the fire took the possibility away. That was the thing he had never been able to fully think through. She had been trying to reach him about something specific, something beyond the general deterioration of their relationship's daily functioning, and he had been too locked in his own operational fog to stop and actually receive it. He wondered sometimes, in the architecture of grief he had built for himself, what she had been trying to say. Mill Haven appeared around a coastal bend in the highway, small, weathered, the kind of town built low against the wind off the water. Fishing boats visible in the small harbor, a main street with a pharmacy and a diner and a hardware store and a building with fresh paint on the exterior and a modest sign that read Mill Haven Community Health Clinic. And Cassian pulled the Escalade to the curb across the street and sat there with the engine running. He had driven 310 miles to this moment, and now that he was here, he could not make himself get out of the car. This was new. Cassian Voss did not hesitate. Hesitation was a thing that happened to other people, people whose decision-making was compromised by emotional static. He had spent years insulating himself from precisely this kind of paralysis, and here he was, sitting in a parked car across the street from a clinic, unable to move, because if he was wrong, if the voice on the radio was some coincidence his grief had twisted into meaning, then walking across that street would cost him something he had very carefully not admitted he was still carrying. And if he was right, it would cost him something else entirely. He got out of the car. The clinic's waiting room was small. 8 chairs, a low table with outdated magazines, a front desk behind a glass partition where a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head was sorting through paper files with the distracted efficiency of someone managing 3 tasks simultaneously. The room held 5 people: an elderly man with a wrapped wrist, a young mother with a toddler on her lap, 2 teenage boys who might have been brothers, and a weathered fishing type in his 50s with a hand wrapped in a dish towel that had gone rust brown in a way that suggested he should have come in considerably earlier. Cassian sat down. He picked up a magazine without seeing it. He watched the door at the back of the waiting room. He waited. 17 minutes passed. He counted them by the clock on the wall above the front desk, a plain round clock with a second hand that had a slight stutter at the 42nd position, catching and releasing, catching and releasing. The toddler on the young mother's lap watched Cassian with the unself-conscious stare that small children deploy freely, and Cassian looked back at the child and thought about nothing and waited. The door opened. She came through it talking to the elderly man she was guiding gently by the elbow, explaining something about his wrist, about keeping it elevated, about coming back in 10 days. And she had cut her hair shorter than he remembered, and her face had changed in the way faces change when 3 years have been hard. And she was wearing a white coat over a green sweater, and she looked real, present, anchored in the small room in a way that made everything around her seem slightly less substantial by comparison. And Cassian's hands tightened on the magazine until the pages bent. She had not looked up yet. She was still talking to the old man, smiling at something he said, guiding him toward the front desk. And then some animal instinct, the thing that keeps humans alive in dangerous situations before the conscious mind catches up, made her pause. She looked up. Across the waiting room, across 8 chairs and a low table and 3 years and a fire and a grave with her name on it, Serena Vale looked directly at Cassian Voss. The color left her face so completely and so instantly that the young mother reached out a hand toward her in alarm. The elderly man said something. The woman at the front desk stood up. Serena did not move. She stood perfectly still with her hand on the old man's arm and her eyes on Cassian and her face the color of old paper, and Cassian stood up from his chair, the magazine falling, and took 1 step toward her. "Serena," he said. It was the first time he had said her name out loud in 3 years. It tasted like something he had thought was gone. She ran. Not for the front door. She was too smart for that, too practiced at whatever survival logic had kept her hidden for 36 months. But for the back of the clinic, through the door she had come from, and Cassian was already moving, past the front desk, past the alarmed receptionist who said, "Sir, you can't," and past the point where that sentence had any relevance, through the door and into a narrow corridor that smelled of antiseptic and floor cleaner, and he could hear her ahead of him, moving fast, a door at the end of the corridor banging open onto an alley behind the building. He pushed through it into gray coastal light and cold salt air. The alley ran between the clinic's back wall and the rear of a hardware store, concrete underfoot, a dumpster, a rusted bicycle locked to a pipe. She was at the far end of the alley where it met a cross street, and she had stopped. She had stopped because there was a black SUV blocking the cross-street exit, which was not his. Cassian had come alone. His Escalade was still on the main road, which meant it was someone else's, and the man stepping out of the driver's side was holding something. And Serena had seen it before Cassian had. She turned, looked back at him. Her face had moved through terror and out the other side into something harder and more complicated. The man from the SUV raised a suppressed pistol. Cassian covered the length of the alley in 4 seconds, hit Serena from the side, took them both down behind the dumpster as the first shot sparked off the concrete where she had been standing. He came up with his own weapon drawn. He was always armed, had been for 20 years. It was as automatic as breathing, and put 2 rounds into the SUV's windshield and 1 into the front tire before the shooter retreated behind the vehicle's open door. Silence. Rain starting again, light this time, barely there. Cassian pressed his back against the dumpster, breathing controlled, and looked down at Serena where she had not yet stood up from the ground. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the terror from earlier. Something calculating, something that was making decisions at speed. "That's not your car," she said. "No." "So they were already here. Before you." It was not a question. She said it the way she said clinical things, with the flat precision of someone filing an observation into a category that already existed. Someone already knew she was here. Someone had been watching the clinic, and Cassian's arrival had either spooked them into moving early or the timing was pure coincidence, which, in his experience, it almost never was. "We need to move," he said. "I'm not going anywhere with you." She said it with the absolute conviction of someone who had made a decision years ago and had no intention of revisiting it under pressure. "There's a man with a gun 30 feet away. I noticed." "Serena, you don't get to call me that." Her voice had gone flat and quiet in a way that was worse than anger. "You don't get to show up here and call me that." The shooter was moving. Cassian could hear it, the subtle shift of weight on concrete, the angle changing. He made a decision. "I'll explain everything," he said. "Every single thing, but not here." "You'll explain." She laughed, a sound with nothing warm in it. That's what you'll do. Serena, please. Something moved across her face at the word. He had said please to very few people in his life, and she knew that, had always known that, had once told him it was one of the things she found both infuriating and oddly moving about him, the selective rarity of it. Something moved across her face and then locked back down. The shooter came around the side of the dumpster. Cassian moved on instinct, fast, precise. The way violence becomes when you have practiced it long enough that it stops requiring thought. And the fight was short and ugly and ended with the shooter on the ground and not moving. Cassian stood over him breathing hard, aware of Serena behind him watching, and turned. She had not run. He had expected her to run. She was standing with her back against the clinic's rear wall and her arms crossed against her chest, and she was looking at him with those eyes, the same specific depth of attention, and she looked exhausted and furious, and something else he could not immediately name. "He's not one of yours," she said. She had looked at the man on the ground with the clinical eye of someone who had learned in the years since she disappeared to look at such things and extract information from them. "No." "Then who sent him?" "I don't know yet." And that was true, which was the part that bothered him most. "But I'm going to find out." She looked at him for a long time. The rain came down, indifferent, light. "You have a car," she finally said. "On the main road. If I get in that car," she said, "you're going to tell me everything. All of it. From the beginning." "Yes." "And if I decide I want to leave?" "You leave," he said. "I won't stop you." She studied his face the way she used to study charts, looking for the thing that wasn't adding up, the indicator that contradicted the surface reading. Whatever she found there, it was enough. She pushed off the wall. "Don't walk next to me," she said. "Walk behind me, like you're nobody, like you don't know me." It was, he realized, almost certainly exactly how she had been living for 3 years, like nobody knew her, like she didn't exist. He followed her out of the alley and down the main street of Millhaven at a distance. And when they reached the Escalade, she got in the passenger side without being asked and sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring through the windshield at the gray harbor and the fishing boats and the life she had built here in the particular way you build things when you believe the alternative is death. Cassian started the engine, did not pull out yet. "How long have you known where I was?" she asked. 5 days. "And before that?" He looked at her. "I thought you were dead." The muscle in her jaw worked. She said nothing. "I have been putting flowers on a grave in Chicago for 3 years," he said. "A grave with your name on it." Something happened in her expression. A crack, small, quickly contained. She turned her face toward the window. "Then you need to understand something," she said, to the window, to the harbor, to whatever calculation she was running behind her eyes. "I didn't disappear to hurt you. I disappeared because I was told that if I didn't run, you would finish what you started." The sentence landed like a hand pressed flat against his chest. "What I started," he repeated. "The fire, Cassian." She turned back to him then, and her eyes were dry. She had moved past the kind of grief that produced tears a long time ago. He could see that, but the fury in them was very much alive. "I was told you ordered the fire. I was told you'd found out what I knew and decided I was a liability." The silence in the Escalade was the loudest thing he had ever heard. "Who told you that?" he said. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, reading his face, running the calculation. "Adrian," she said, and there it was. The name that had been sitting at the center of something he hadn't known was wrong, waiting to be identified. Adrian Mercer, his right hand, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who had stepped up in the months after the fire and run the operation with such steady competence that Cassian had come to rely on him in the way you only relied on people who had proven themselves in the worst circumstances. The man who had been there the night of the fire. The man who had handled the investigation afterward. The man who had, Cassian now understood, been the only person positioned to shape everything that followed. "Drive," Serena said quietly, "and start talking." He pulled out onto Millhaven's main road, pointed away from the harbor, and began. Outside the town limits, beyond a ridge of coastal pines where the signal was bad and the angle was good, A man in a gray sedan lowered his binoculars and picked up his phone. He watched the black Escalade disappear around a bend. He dialed a single contact. When the line connected, he said only 4 words. Voss found the doctor. The voice on the other end was very calm. I know, said Adrian Mercer. Let him. They drove for 40 minutes without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much, and neither of them had figured out yet how to begin without the whole thing collapsing under its own weight. Cassian kept his eyes on the road. Serena kept hers on the side window, watching the coastal landscape give way to inland pine and flat gray farmland, her arms still crossed, her breathing measured in the deliberate way of someone who had learned to use breath as a tool, not for calm exactly, but for containment. He noticed the way she held herself now. 3 years ago, she had carried her body differently, looser, more given to movement, to leaning forward when she was interested in something, to the unconscious expressiveness of a person who had not yet learned to treat their own reactions as security vulnerabilities. The woman sitting in his passenger seat held herself like someone who had spent a long time making sure nothing showed on the outside that could be used against her. He recognized it because he had spent 20 years learning to do the same thing, and he knew what it cost. It had cost her something she was not going to get back. That was on him. Whatever she had learned to become in the last 3 years, the watchfulness, the containment, the practiced stillness, he had not caused it directly, but he had failed to prevent it. And in his accounting system, those 2 things had always been functionally identical. He pulled off the main road onto a county route that ran through empty farmland. Old habit. Open sight lines. No cover for surveillance vehicles, easier to spot a tail. Serena noticed. He saw her notice. You're running a counter-surveillance pattern, she said. First words in 40 minutes. Yes. On a county road in the middle of nowhere. Someone already knew where you were, Serena. That shooter didn't follow me from Chicago. I drove clean, I checked. He was already there, which means someone has been watching your clinic, possibly for weeks. He paused. I want to know if anyone picked up my arrival and called it in. She absorbed this. He could see her working through the implications the same way she worked through a diagnosis, systematically, without letting what she wanted the answer to be interfere with what the evidence actually suggested. I've been careful, she said. For 3 years I have been extremely careful. I know. I don't use my real name. I don't contact anyone from before. I don't... She stopped. Reset. I built a whole life specifically so no one could find me. I found you from a radio broadcast. The words landed harder than he intended. He watched her jaw tighten. It was a mistake, she said quietly. Dr. Henley, the program director, he asked me to do the interview for fundraising purposes. I said no 3 times. The 4th time I said yes because I was tired of saying no to everything, and I thought... She exhaled through her nose. I thought enough time had passed. It hadn't. No? A beat. Apparently not. He turned on to a 2-lane road heading north, toward a stretch of uninhabited coastal bluff he had identified on the drive down as a defensible stop if he needed one. He had been doing that automatically, cataloging fallback positions, threat angles, extraction routes, since before he reached Millhaven. Some habits didn't wait for conscious instruction. Tell me exactly what Adrian told you, he said. The night of the fire, everything you remember. She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her deciding how much to give him, running the risk calculation, how much information shared, how much control surrendered. He understood the calculation. He waited. It was Adrian who called me, she said, around 9 that night. You were supposed to meet me for dinner, and you hadn't shown up, and you weren't answering your phone. And I was angry. Not scared yet, just angry, because it was the 3rd time that month you'd gone dark without explanation. She said this without inflection, as statement rather than accusation, but the flatness of it was its own kind of precision. Adrian called and said there'd been a situation at the warehouse district. He said you were handling it personally and he needed me to come to a secondary location, that you'd asked him to bring me there because it wasn't safe at our place. I never asked him that. I know that now. She looked at her hands. I didn't know it then. I trusted Adrian. You trusted Adrian. He was He was always around, always the competent one, always the one who knew where you were when nobody else did. A pause. He drove me to a building 2 blocks from the warehouse. He got a call. He said he'd be right back. He left me there. And then the fire started. The building I was in started filling with smoke. Not the warehouse. The building Adrian had brought me to. Someone had set something in the basement. I broke a window on the 2nd floor and dropped onto a loading dock. I ran. She said this with a flatness that meant she had told it to herself so many times it had been compressed into pure information, all the terror squeezed out through repetition. I ran and I kept running, and 3 blocks away a car came alongside me, and the man inside said if I stopped running, I was dead. Cassian's hands tightened on the wheel. He said nothing. He drove me to a bus station. He gave me an envelope with cash, a prepaid phone with 1 number loaded in it, and a message from Adrian. She recited it from memory, and Cassian could hear from the precision of the recitation that she had turned these words over in her mind so many times they'd worn smooth as riverstone. The message said, "Cassian knows what you found. He's decided you're a problem. The fire was supposed to solve that problem. You survived, which means you have approximately 48 hours before he sends someone who won't miss. Get out, and don't come back, and don't contact anyone. This is the only warning you'll get." The silence after that had its own weight. "And you believed it," Cassian said. "I believed it." She said this without apology or shame. "We had been falling apart for months. You were shutting me out. I'd found something in your files, documents linking your operations to people I'd never heard of, transactions I didn't understand. And I'd tried to bring it to you twice, and both times you'd changed the subject so fast it made my head spin. I thought you knew I'd seen them. I thought—" She stopped. "You thought I was capable of ordering your death." The words sat there between them. "I thought you were capable of deciding I was a threat," she said carefully. "I didn't want to think it, but I'd watched you make hard decisions for 2 years, and I knew what the logic looked like when you decided something had to be removed." She met his eyes for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. "You're sitting here 3 years later, looking like I drove a knife into you, but put yourself back in that parking lot, Cassian, 31 years old, building on fire. Man I barely know handing me an envelope and saying, 'Run.' The person I trusted most in the world apparently trying to kill me." Her voice stayed level. That was almost worse than if it had broken. "What would you have done?" He thought about it honestly. "The same thing," he said. She turned back to the window. They reached the coastal bluff 20 minutes later. He pulled off onto a gravel turnout overlooking the water. The lake was visible from here, massive and gray and indifferent. The horizon blurred where the water met the overcast sky. He cut the engine. No other vehicles visible in any direction. "The documents you found," he said. "What were they?" She shifted in her seat to face him more directly, which he had learned years ago meant she had decided to commit to something, had stopped hedging. "Transaction records. Wire transfers, but structured oddly. Amounts that matched no invoice or contract I could find in the system. Routing through shell entities in 3 different countries. And names. Politicians, cash-in. Names I recognized from news coverage. State level, federal level, one name I recognized from a Senate Oversight Committee." She paused. "I thought you were bribing them. That's what I assumed at first. Then I looked at the amounts and the structure, and I realized it wasn't bribery. The money was going the other direction. They were paying into your operations." "For what?" "I didn't know then." She said it carefully. "I've had 3 years to think about it." "And?" "Trafficking," she said. "Not drugs, people. The kind of operation that needs political protection and coast access and an existing distribution infrastructure." She watched his face. "You didn't know." It was not a question. "No," he said. And then, because she deserved the full answer, "I would have found it eventually. I was already noticing inconsistencies in the Eastern logistics chain, numbers that didn't map to declared operations." He looked at the lake. "Adrian ran that division." "Adrian ran that division," she echoed. "And I stumbled onto the records that proved it, and he knew I'd seen them, or suspected I had, and he decided to solve 2 problems at once," Cassian said. "Remove the evidence, remove you, and frame me for both." The architecture of it settled into place between them, piece by piece, and it was elegant in the horrible way that truly vicious plans were elegant. Not overcomplicated, just ruthlessly well positioned. Adrian had been the man who handled the investigation after the fire. Adrian had been the man who managed communications with the forensics team. Adrian had been the man who first told Cassian that the remains found in the rubble were consistent with a female victim of the right age. The man who had sat across from him in the operations center and said, "I'm sorry, Cassian," with the practiced solemnity of someone who had been rehearsing the moment and found it came naturally. 3 years of that. 3 years of Adrian sitting in meetings and giving counsel and running operations and looking Cassian in the eye. "How long has he been planning to take over?" Serena asked. "I don't know yet." His voice was very quiet. "But I'm going to find out." "You're going to confront him." "Eventually. If you confront him before you know everything he knows and everyone he has in place, he'll see it coming and you'll lose whatever advantage you—" "I know how to do this, Serena." "I know you do." She said it without backing down. "I also know that you want to put your hands around his throat inside the next 20 minutes, and that impulse is going to get you killed if you don't manage it." He looked at her. "You know me," he said. "I used to." She said it like a door closing. Not cruel, just precise. "I don't know what 3 years does to a person. It didn't change what matters." "It changed everything, Cassian. You just can't see it yet because you've been operating from the grief version of who I was, and the real version is sitting right here, and she's a lot more difficult." He almost smiled. Didn't. "Good," he said. "I could use difficult." His phone went off. He looked at the screen. Marcus, calling on the secondary line, which had a specific meaning, something urgent that couldn't wait for a callback window. He answered. "Talk," he said. Marcus's voice was tight in the way it got when he was managing adrenaline. Clipped, efficient, the unnecessary words already edited out. "We have a problem at the Dearborn house. 2 of our guys were jumped about an hour ago, coming back from the supply run. Professional. Suppressed weapons, no plates on the vehicle, they pulled back clean. Elias took one in the shoulder. He's okay, it's through and through. But they took the access ledger, Cassian, the physical one from the operations room. Cassian was quiet for 2 seconds. "What was in the rotation for this week's ledger?" "Safe house locations, 8 of them, including the 3 we use for witness holding." Serena was watching his face. He kept it still. "Pull everyone from those locations right now," he said. "Move the witnesses to the contingency sites, change the protocols, assume the new locations are compromised within 24 hours as well. And Marcus, who knew we kept a physical ledger in the Dearborn operations room?" A pause. He could hear Marcus working through it. "Inner circle," Marcus said. 6 people. Maybe 8 if you count the support staff with full access. Adrian has full access." Another pause, longer this time. "Yeah," Marcus said. "He does." "Don't tell him about this call. Don't tell him about anything. If he asks about the Dearborn incident, it was a random hit, street crew, nothing coordinated. You're handling it. Can you do that?" "I can do that." "What are you—" Marcus stopped himself. "Are you coming back to the city?" Cassian looked at Serena. She had caught enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it, and she was watching him with that assessing look, running the calculation, what this new information meant, what the geometry of the threat was, where they were positioned relative to it. "Not yet," Cassian said. "Keep this line open." He hung up. "They hit one of your safe houses," Serena said. They took a ledger with location data. Escalation. She said it the way she'd say a diagnosis. "They know you found me. Adrian knows, so now he's moving, trying to destabilize your operations while you're off balance." She paused. "He's been waiting for something to trigger this. You coming to find me was the trigger." Which means he had this prepared. The teams, the access, the timing. Cassian looked at the gray lake and felt something cold settle through him that had nothing to do with the wind off the water. He's been ready to move for a while. He was just waiting for the right moment. "How loyal are your people?" "Most of them, but most isn't all, and I don't know which ones are his yet. So you can't go back to Chicago and handle this through your normal channels because you don't know who in your normal channels is working for him." "No. And you can't stay here because whoever was watching my clinic already called in your location." "No." So we're mobile, she said, which means we need somewhere to go that Adrian doesn't know about. He noted the we. He was fairly certain she noted it too and had decided to let it stand for now, which was a different thing from meaning it, but it was something. I have a property, he said. Off book, never run through the syndicate. Adrian doesn't know it exists. How far? 2 hours north. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd made a clinical decision and was moving to the next step. Then she reached into the pocket of her white coat. She was still wearing it, had run without taking it off, and pulled out a phone. Old model, clearly prepaid, the back held on with a strip of tape. I need to call the clinic, she said. My nurse, she needs to know I'm not coming back tomorrow. Keep it short. Don't say where you are. She gave him a look that said she had been managing operational security without his input for 3 years and did not require instruction. He raised one hand in acknowledgement and started the engine while she dialed. He listened to her half of the conversation. Brief, calm, professional, telling the nurse that a family emergency had come up and she'd be in touch as soon as she could, that Dr. Paulson from the county office could provide emergency coverage, that she was sorry and the patients mattered and she would explain when she could. The way she spoke to the nurse was different from the way she spoke to him. Warmer, less armored, the natural register of a person with people they had chosen to trust. It reminded him that she had built a life in Millhaven, not just a cover, a life. Patients who depended on her, a colleague she cared about, work that meant something. He had shown up and blown it apart. She ended the call and looked at the prepaid phone for a moment, and then rolled down the window and threw it into the coastal scrub. Burner, she said. I have others. You've been running burner phones for 3 years. I've been running everything for 3 years. She said it without self-pity, which made it heavier somehow. You learn. He pulled back onto the county road heading north. The sky was doing something complicated in the west, dark at the horizon but lit strangely where the overcast broke near the water's edge, a band of amber that had no business being as vivid as it was in a sky that gray. They drove. After a while, she said, The documents I found. I copied them before I ran. He processed this. You have copies, in a format that survived 3 years and 2 moves. She looked at him steadily. If they show what I think they show, if the transaction records are what I believe they are, they don't just implicate Adrian. They implicate his political network. Senators. Potentially federal agency contacts. She paused. That's why he needed to destroy the originals and eliminate me. It's not just about internal syndicate power. It's about what those documents do if they reach the right people. They dismantle the whole infrastructure, Cassian said slowly. Not just his operation. Every political connection he's spent years cultivating. Every protection he has, she said. Every layer of cover, gone. This was larger than a betrayal. This was a man who had spent 3 years, probably longer, probably starting before the fire, building a parallel power structure inside and alongside Cassian's organization, using syndicate resources and political leverage to run a trafficking operation that generated its own revenue and its own protections, preparing for a moment when he could step out from under Cassian's shadow entirely. The fire had not been impulsive. It had been strategic. Remove Serena. Remove the evidence. Frame Cassian for the order. Position himself as the loyal lieutenant holding the organization together through the boss's grief. And it had worked. For 3 years, it had worked perfectly. Cassian drove north through the darkening afternoon and felt the rage in him reorganize itself. Not the hot, impulsive kind. He had burned that out years ago. The cold kind. The kind that was patient and thorough and did not require immediate expression because it had already decided on the outcome and was simply planning the route. You said you have the copies, he said. Yes. Where? Somewhere we can get to. She did not specify, which meant she was still not fully trusting him with the complete picture, which was rational and which he respected, and which also meant she was smarter now than the version of her he had known, and he had already thought she was the smartest person he'd ever been in a room with. I'm going to need them, he said. I know. Not to protect myself, to expose the whole network. I know, Cassian. She said it quietly. I've been sitting on those documents for 3 years waiting for a way to use them that didn't get me killed. I'm not going to protect them now that we're already in the fire. The word landed. fire, and neither of them acknowledged it, but it landed. The phone went off again. Not Marcus this time. A number he didn't recognize, which was unusual because very few people had this number. And the ones who did were either in his contacts or were wrong numbers. And something about the timing of it, the particular moment, 40 minutes into a drive north, trailing trouble, made him answer with the caution he'd give a potential threat. "Voss," he said, a woman's voice, low, controlled, precise. "You don't know me. My name isn't important right now. What's important is that I've been embedded in Adrian Mercer's operation for 14 months, and I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you before he realizes I've made this call." Cassian's jaw tightened. He said nothing, letting her continue. "He knows you found the doctor. He knows your current direction of travel. He has a team positioned at the junction of Route 9 and the coastal highway. That's approximately 16 miles north of your current position. 3 vehicles, 8 men. He's not trying to negotiate, and he's not trying to warn you off." Her voice stayed flat and even as a newsreader delivering weather. "He's trying to make sure neither of you reaches wherever you're going." Cassian looked at the road ahead. Route 9 junction, 16 miles, she'd said. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because what he's running is something I can't let continue," she said. "And because if you're dead, the only person with both the resources and the motivation to stop him is gone." "Who do you work for? Right now?" "I work for the outcome." A pause. "Don't take Route 9. There's an old logging access road at the 14-mile mark on your left. Unmarked, chain across the entrance. The chain isn't locked. It will add 40 minutes to your route, but it bypasses the junction entirely." The line went dead. Serena had been listening. Of course she had been listening. She turned to look at him with an expression that had cycled through surprise and suspicion and arrived somewhere more complicated. "Do you trust it?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I trust the geometry. If Adrian knows our direction, Route 9 is exactly where he'd position. Could be a redirect. Get us off the main road onto the logging access into a tighter kill zone. Could be. So which is it?" He thought for 3 seconds. The woman's voice had been controlled and precise, the kind of control that came from practice, not composure. The kind of voice that belonged to someone doing a dangerous thing calmly because panic was not an option. He had heard that voice before, in various people, in various situations. He knew what it cost. "Logging road," he said. He pushed the Escalade to 90 and watched the mile markers. At the 14-mile mark, he saw it. A break in the tree line on the left, a rusted chain across a dirt track, exactly as described. He hit the brakes hard, turned off the headlights, and took the turn at speed. The chain was there. He stopped, got out, lifted it, drove through, replaced it behind them. The logging road was rough, deep ruts, overhanging branches close enough to drag against the roof. No light except what the headlights threw. He drove it at 20 miles per hour with full concentration, and beside him Serena sat with both hands braced against the dashboard and said nothing for 6 full minutes. Then her phone rang. Not the prepaid she'd thrown. She'd said she had others. This one came from inside her coat pocket, small and cheap, and when she looked at the screen, her face did something he hadn't seen it do yet. It went white. "That number," she said. "That number shouldn't exist." "Who is it?" She looked at him. In the low light of the logging road, her face was all shadow and the particular quality of fear that comes, not from a threat you can see, but from one that tells you your understanding of the situation was wrong in a way that changes everything. "It's the number from the envelope," she said. "The one Adrian gave me the night of the fire. The emergency contact I was told to use if I was ever found." Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I never called it. Not once in 3 years. I didn't trust it." She looked at the ringing phone. "Someone is calling me from that number right now." The phone rang 3 more times in her hand, then it stopped. And in the silence that followed, a single text message arrived. She turned the screen so he could read it. "You were never supposed to survive the fire. Neither was he. Adrian kept you alive because you're the only leverage that makes Cassian controllable. You are not a person to him. You are a leash. Someone who is running out of time." The logging road stretched ahead of them, dark and narrow, leading somewhere neither of them had fully mapped. Behind them, through the trees, the distant sound of vehicles on Route 9 moved north and then slowed and then stopped. Cassian looked at the message, then at Serena, then at the road ahead. "He kept you alive on purpose," he said. "He kept me alive to use against you," she said, "which means he always knew where you were." The words settled between them like something falling from a height, taking a long time to land, which meant the clinic, the shooter, the black SUV in the alley. It had not been an attempt to silence a loose end. It had been a demonstration, a signal to Cassian, delivered in the language of violence. "I have her. I've always had her. And now that you've found her, you've walked directly into..." The logging road ended at a dirt clearing surrounded by pine on 3 sides and open sky on the 4th, where the tree line broke against a ridge, and you could see the coast highway below like a gray ribbon with 2 sets of headlights sitting still on it, not moving, positioned exactly where the woman on the phone had said they would be. Cassian killed the engine. They sat in the dark and looked at the headlights below, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the text message was still on Serena's phone screen between them, and it had rearranged the geometry of everything they thought they understood about the last 3 years. "He kept you alive to use against you. You are not a person to him. You are a leash." Cassian took the phone from her hand gently. She let him take it, and read the message again as though a second reading would yield something different. It didn't. He set the phone on the dashboard face down and looked at the headlights below, and ran the new geometry through his mind with the cold thoroughness he applied to every operational problem, stripping out the emotional content because the emotional content was enormous and would have to wait. Adrian had known where Serena was. Not recently, always, from the beginning, which meant the 2.5 years of building a new identity, the careful erasure of every connection to her former life, the burner phones and the different name and the clinic in a town nobody knew. None of it had been real protection. It had been a cage with a long leash attached. Adrian had let her run because a Serena Vale, who was alive and hidden somewhere, was infinitely more useful than a Serena Vale who was dead and gone. Dead, she was leverage that expired. Alive, she was a permanent mechanism of control. The one vulnerability in Cassian Voss that could be activated at the right moment in the right circumstances to produce a predictable result. And Cassian had delivered the result precisely on schedule. He had found her, driven to her, and led Adrian's people directly to both of them in the same afternoon. "He played us both," Serena said. Her voice was very quiet and had a quality he recognized from people who were holding something large and destructive very carefully, the way you held something that could shatter and cut you if it slipped. "For 3 years," Cassian said. "Longer." She turned to look at him in the dark. "He was already building this before the fire, Cassian. The documents I found those transactions go back 5 years. He was running his parallel operation inside your organization for at least 5 years before any of this happened. The fire wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment he decided the preparation was complete enough to move. 5 years." Cassian turned this over. 5 years ago, he had promoted Adrian to the inner circle, given him access to the Eastern logistics chain, trusted him with the organizational architecture that was the actual engine of the syndicate's power. He had done this because Adrian had been competent and loyal and present in exactly the way that inspired trust. Never grabbing for more than he was given, always deferring, always the steady hand in the room when other people were losing their composure. 5 years of that. 5 years of performance. "We can't stay here," Serena said. "No. The property you mentioned, the off-book one. 1 hour north from here, off the logging road. If we take the back route, we bypass the junction entirely." He looked at the headlights below, calculating. They hadn't moved. "They're waiting for us to reappear on the main road. They don't know about the logging route. Yet." "Yet," he agreed. He started the engine, no headlights, and navigated the clearing by memory and the thin ambient light coming off the overcast sky. The logging road continued north in 2 directions from the clearing. He took the right fork, which the woman on the phone had not mentioned, but which his earlier map study had shown, connecting eventually to a series of rural farm roads that would bring them out well north of the junction. He drove slowly, carefully, watching for ruts. Beside him, Serena held the grab handle above the door and stared through the windshield, and he could feel her thinking. Not the passive kind of thinking, the active kind, the kind that produced results. "The woman who called you," she said, 14 months embedded. That's long enough to have real information, but also long enough to have been turned or positioned specifically for this moment. I know. The logging road tip was real. The vehicles are there, we can see them. But real information at the right moment is how you build trust for the false information that comes after. Also no. So she could be genuinely embedded in trying to help. Or she could be Adrian's, feeding us controlled information to get us somewhere specific. The off-book property isn't in any system he has access to, Cassian said. It's not in the ledger they took. It's not in any digital record connected to the syndicate. I bought it through a third-party, cash transaction 8 years ago, before Adrian was anywhere near the inner circle. Serena absorbed this. That's the one thing you have that he can't know. That's the one thing. She nodded once and went back to watching the dark road ahead. They reached the off-book property at 9:30. It was a farmhouse on 40 acres of flat land, low and weathered, a structure that had been built for function and had never had pretensions beyond that. Solid walls, a working furnace, windows that faced all 4 compass directions, a storm cellar underneath the kitchen with a second exit that came up in the barn 60 yards from the main house. Cassian had maintained it intermittently over 8 years, not as an operational site, but as a personal reserve. The kind of place that existed specifically for a situation in which all other options had been compromised. He had never needed it before. He was somewhat grimly grateful he had kept it. He pulled the Escalade into the barn and killed the engine, and they sat in the barn dark for a moment, listening to the property settle around them. Wind against the walls, the creak of old timber, nothing else. Inside, the farmhouse was cold and spare. He got the furnace running while Serena moved through the rooms with the methodical efficiency of someone conducting a security assessment, checking sight lines through the windows, confirming exit routes, cataloging what was available. He watched her do this from the kitchen doorway and thought about the person she had been 3 years ago. Not weaker, she had never been weak, but less armored, less practiced at this particular kind of watchfulness. He had done that to her. Not alone, not intentionally, but the chain of causation ran through him. He found food in the pantry, canned goods, dry staples, nothing fresh but enough. He opened 2 cans of something and put them on the stove without discussing it, because they hadn't eaten since before Millhaven and the body had requirements that didn't wait for emotional resolution. Serena came back to the kitchen and sat at the table and looked at her hands. She had taken off the white coat finally, folded it over the back of a chair, and in the sweater beneath she looked more like herself. The self he remembered, which was disorienting in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had built a version of her in his memory over 3 years, and the real version kept diverging from it in ways that were simultaneously better and harder. "Tell me about the documents," he said. "Specifically, what you copied, what format, where they are now." She looked up. "You want to do this now?" "We have time tonight. We won't always." She considered him for a moment. Then she said, "Scanned files, encrypted on a drive. The drive is at a location in a town called Hartwell, 40 miles southeast. I have a storage unit there under a name that doesn't connect to either Sarah Vance or Serena Vale." She paused. "I need to get to it. Tomorrow. Tonight we stay here." "Cassian, one night, Serena. We need to think before we move, and we can't think while we're moving." She looked like she wanted to argue. Then the furnace ticked on properly, and the kitchen began to warm, and some of the rigidity in her shoulders came down by a fraction. Just a fraction, barely visible. But he saw it. She was exhausted. She had been running on adrenaline since the moment she'd looked up from the clinic floor and seen his face, and adrenaline had a balance sheet. "One night," she said. He put the food on the table. They ate without ceremony, standing at first, then sitting, the way you ate when food was function rather than occasion. Outside, the wind picked up and drove rain against the north-facing windows in irregular bursts. Halfway through the meal, his phone rang. Marcus again, secondary line. "It's bad," Marcus said before Cassian could speak. "Tell me." "The witnesses we moved from the compromised safe houses, 2 of them didn't make it to the contingency sites. The transport teams lost contact. We found 1 car. Empty. No blood, no signs of struggle, just empty. Parked on a service road outside the city like someone had stepped out for air and kept walking." Marcus's voice was controlled, but Cassian could hear what was underneath it. "The witnesses were federal cooperation cases, Cassian, pending testimony. If Adrian has them, he can shut down the prosecutions," Cassian said. "Every case they were material to." That's 12 open matters. 3 of them touch his operation directly. Which means he didn't just plan for tonight. He had extraction teams ready to move the moment the situation changed. Cassian looked at the kitchen wall and processed this with the part of his mind that operated on pure logic, separated from everything else. He's been sitting on this capacity for months, waiting. There's more. Marcus stopped. Started again. Reyes is gone. The name hit differently. Reyes, Elena Reyes, his logistics coordinator, 15 years with the organization, one of the 6 people Cassian had mentally labeled as certainly loyal when he'd done the inner circle calculation in the car earlier. Gone how? He said. Cleaned out her apartment, cars at the airport. She used a commercial flight under her real name, which means she either panicked and made a mistake, or she wanted us to know she was gone and couldn't be retrieved. A pause. She had full access to the Eastern Logistics chain routing, same chain Adrian ran. The Eastern Logistics chain. The same structure Serena had found evidence about in the documents 5 years back. Reyes had been Adrian's subordinate before she'd been promoted to Cassian's direct staff. The promotion had been Adrian's recommendation. He had recommended her. Cassian had approved her without sufficient independent assessment because Adrian's judgment on personnel had always appeared to be, reliable. How many people do you trust right now? Cassian said. Absolutely. Not probably. Absolutely. Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. 3? Maybe 4? Work with 3. The 4th is a question mark, and right now question marks are operational liabilities. What do I do about Adrian? He's asking questions. He's noticed you've been out of contact, and he's making the rounds, talking to people, presenting himself as managing the situation in your absence, which was exactly what he would do. Exactly the behavior of a man who had been preparing for this transition and recognized the moment had arrived. Every hour Cassian stayed out of contact was an hour Adrian spent consolidating, calling in favors, repositioning loyal assets, building the internal narrative that made his eventual seizure of authority look like continuity rather than coup. Tell him I'm handling a personal matter, Cassian said. Tell him I'll be in contact tomorrow. Nothing more. He won't buy it. He doesn't need to buy it. He just needs 24 hours to think I'm still in the dark. He hung up. Serena had stopped eating and was watching him with full attention. How bad? She said. He told her. All of it. The missing witnesses, Reyes, the consolidation happening in the city while they sat in a farmhouse 40 miles from the documents that could potentially end Adrian's entire structure. He told her because she was in it now, whether she wanted to be, because she had information he needed and he had resources she needed, and because he admitted this to himself with the blunt honesty he generally reserved for operational assessment. He was not willing to manage this alone. Not this. Not with Adrian on one side and the whole compromised organization on the other, and whatever remained of the 3 years between them sitting unresolved in the kitchen alongside the empty cans. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He's going to make a move on you directly. Not through proxies. The proxies are to isolate you, cut off resources, compromise your people, take away your options. Once that's done, he'll want to be the one who finishes it. I know, because it has to be clean for him. If you disappear without a clear ending, there's always the question. He needs it to be definitive. She paused. And he needs the documents. He knows I have copies. He's known for 3 years and he let it sit, because as long as I was under his control, the copies were under his control. She looked at her hands on the table. The moment we reach Hartwell and pick up that drive, it changes. He'll know. And he'll move. How would he know? She looked up at him. Because the storage unit has been under observation for 14 months. The sentence dropped into the room and stayed there. Cassian went very still. You knew, he said. Not an accusation. Just the fact of it, landing. I suspected. 8 months ago, I ran a counter-surveillance check on the area around the storage facility. I identified a vehicle that appeared 3 times over 2 weeks. Different driver each time, same vehicle, parked in different positions with clear sightlines to the facility entrance. She held his gaze steadily. I didn't retrieve the drive. I left it there and I changed nothing about my routine, and I waited to see what they would do. They did nothing. Because as long as you didn't retrieve it, retrieving it themselves was secondary to maintaining the surveillance. The drive is more valuable as a tracking device than as evidence. If they take it, they lose the ability to watch who comes for it. Yes, she said. So it's a trap. The whole thing is a trap. The drive is real. I put it there. The documents are on it. But accessing it triggers a response. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers against her temple, a gesture he recognized, the physical tell of a mental process under strain. I've been trying to figure out for 8 months how to get to it without triggering the response. I haven't solved it. He sat back in his chair. Outside, the rain had intensified, driving hard against the windows now, the kind of rain that made the world beyond the glass feel very far away. Then we don't go to the drive, he said. The documents are on the drive. Do you remember what's on them? She looked at him. I've read those files so many times over 3 years that I could reconstruct them from memory with approximately 90% accuracy. That's enough. Reconstructed documents from memory don't hold up the same way. They hold up well enough to direct federal investigators to the original sources, he said. The original transactions exist somewhere in a financial system. The original wire records exist. The shell entities are registered somewhere. We give investigators a map detailed enough to find the originals independently, and the documents on the drive become corroboration rather than foundation. He leaned forward. Adrian is watching the drive because he thinks it's the only copy. He thinks your memory is manageable. You're one person. You can be silenced. He doesn't know you've been cataloging this for 3 years. Something shifted in her expression. The calculating look again, running it through. It could work, she said carefully, if we can get the information to people who won't suppress it, who aren't already inside his political network. I have a federal contact, Cassian said, outside his reach. I'm reasonably certain. Reasonably certain. In the current situation, reasonably certain is the best available. She exhaled slowly through her nose. We'd need to move fast. If he's already consolidating in the city. The farmhouse phone rang. They both looked at it. The farmhouse had a landline, old, analog, connected to a number Cassian had never given to anyone. Not Marcus, not any member of the organization, not any person on Earth that he was aware of. It rang again. He crossed the kitchen and picked it up. I was wondering how long it would take you to get there, Adrian Mercer said. The voice was exactly as Cassian remembered it. Measured, slightly warm, carrying that quality of practiced steadiness that had made Cassian trust him across 15 years of operational decisions. Hearing it now was like hearing a language that had been legitimate once and was now revealed as a cipher for something else entirely. Cassian said nothing. He waited. The farmhouse, Adrian continued. I want you to know I always knew about it. Not from your records. You're right. It's not in anything I have access to through the organization. I knew about it because I've been tracking your financial behavior for a long time, Cassian. Longer than you'd be comfortable with. A cash purchase through a third party 8 years ago, certain patterns in your personal accounts around the same period. It wasn't difficult to identify once I knew what to look for. And a pause. The pause of a man who was enjoying this. I want you to know, because I want you to stop believing there's something he doesn't know. There isn't. What do you want, Adrian? I want what I've been building toward for 8 years, Adrian said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. I want you to stop. I want the organization to transfer cleanly, and I want the doctor to come in, not because I plan to hurt her. I want to be very clear about that. She's been useful to me alive, and I'm not sentimental about waste, but because there are loose ends attached to her existence that need to be managed. Managed. She has information. You figured that out by now. She also has people who care about her, that clinic, those patients. And I'd hate for the situation around her disappearance to become complicated for people who don't deserve to be caught in it. The warmth in his voice had not changed. It had never been warmth. It had been a very good reproduction of warmth. I'm offering you a clean ending, Cassian. Your empire becomes mine. You and the doctor disappear in a way that's comfortable and final. Nobody else gets hurt. And if I say no, then tomorrow morning I release information to 3 separate media outlets suggesting that Cassian Voss personally ordered the trafficking operation I've been running through your logistics chain for 5 years. I have documentation, fabricated, obviously, but thorough, that positions you as the architect. You become the story. Every federal agency with an interest in the organization focuses on you, and while they're focused on you, I finish the transition quietly and efficiently. Another pause. I've also taken the liberty of having your federal contact, the one you were probably thinking about using tonight, brought in for a conversation. He won't be available to you. Boo. Boo. Cassian's hand tightened on the phone receiver. He kept his voice flat. How long do I have? Sunrise, Adrian said. That's generous, I think, given the circumstances. The line went dead. Cassian set the receiver down carefully. He turned to find Serena standing in the kitchen doorway, having heard his half of the conversation, having read the rest from his face. She was standing straight, arms at her sides, and her expression had moved through whatever it needed to move through and arrived at something clear and hard and decided. He has the federal contact, Cassian said. I heard. He's going to release fabricated documentation that puts the trafficking operation on me. I heard that too. At sunrise, which gives us... He looked at the window. The darkness outside was deep, well past midnight. 5 hours. Maybe 6. Serena crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and looked up at his face with those eyes that had always seen more than he was offering and said, Then we stop trying to find a safe route and we go directly at him. With what? With me, she said. With what I know. With the fact that he thinks I'm an asset he controls and I'm not. I never was. He just didn't know it. She reached into the pocket of her folded white coat on the chair behind her and produced a small object, a USB drive, old, scratched, with a strip of tape around the casing identical to the tape on her burner phone. He stared at it. The storage unit in Hartwell is under surveillance, she said. I told you that. I didn't tell you that 14 months ago. When I identified the surveillance, I made a decision. She set the drive on the kitchen table between them. I went back in the middle of the night with a car I borrowed from a neighbor and retrieved the drive and left a copy on an identical drive in its place. She met his eyes steadily. They've been watching an empty drive for 14 months. The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. You've had the documents this whole time, he said. I've had them this whole time. And you didn't use them because one person with a drive full of evidence is a target. One person with a drive full of evidence and no infrastructure to deploy it is a liability to themselves. She did not look away from him. I needed someone who could move it fast enough and wide enough that suppression became impossible. I needed someone with the right kind of enemies and the right kind of reach. She paused. I needed you. I just didn't know if I could trust you. And now? She looked at the drive on the table, then at him. Adrian just told you he owns your federal contact, she said, which means your instinct is to go around him. Find another channel, move faster than he can block. She picked up the drive and held it out to him. I know a journalist. Independent, no organizational affiliation, been working the trafficking beat for 4 years. Adrian doesn't know she exists because she's never published under her real name and she's never worked through a mainstream outlet. She's been building the same case from the outside that I've been sitting on from the inside. Her hand was steady. If we can reach her before sunrise and get her this drive... He'll try to stop it, Cassian said. Yes. Which means we have to draw him out into the open. He took the drive, felt the weight of it, negligible, physically, and enormous in every other sense. Away from the city, away from the organization, just him. And how do you do that? Cassian looked at the drive in his palm. Then he looked at Serena and felt the 3 years and the fire and the grief and the rage all compress into something that was almost simple, a single clear point of pressure against a single clear objective. I call him back, he said, and I tell him I'll give him what he wants. A meeting, just the two of us. I tell him I'm ready to hand over the organization. He closed his hand around the drive. While you get the documents to the journalist. The color came back into her face slowly, replaced by something that was not quite hope and not quite fury, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She looked at him for a long moment. He won't come alone, she said. No. And you won't be handing anything over? No. So you're walking into a room with a man who has 8 years of preparation and a full complement of armed personnel, and you're doing it as a distraction so I can... So you're walking into a room with a man who has 8 years of preparation and a full complement of armed personnel, and you're doing it as a distraction so I can run. Yes, Cassian said. She stared at him. That's not a plan. That's a suicide note with logistics attached. It's the only play we have before sunrise. There has to be another... Serena. He said it quietly, not cutting her off, just stopping the momentum of the argument before it used time they didn't have. He's going to release the fabricated documentation in 6 hours, regardless of what we do. The federal contact is gone. My organization is compromised. The only thing standing between Adrian Mercer and complete control of everything is that drive in my hand and a journalist you trust. He looked at her straight. So I need you to trust her enough to run. And I need you to trust me enough to believe I'm not walking in there to die. Are you? The question sat there between them, honest and undecorated. No, he said. I'm walking in there to make him look at me long enough that he forgets to look at you. She held his gaze for 4 full seconds. He could see her running it, the probability calculations, the failure modes, the variables she couldn't control. He had watched her make hard clinical decisions at speed before, and it had always looked like this, like someone walking to the edge of something and making a deliberate choice to step. I need 2 hours, she said, to reach the journalist and transmit the files. I'll give you 3. 2 is enough. 3 is too long for you to stall. Then 2. She took the drive back from him and held it in her closed fist and said, If you die, I will be extraordinarily angry with you. He almost smiled again. It almost worked this time. I know, he said. They moved fast after that. No wasted motion, no ceremony. Cassian got on the secondary line to Marcus and gave him a stripped-down version, enough to position Marcus and his 3 absolutely trusted people at a location 2 miles from the meeting point, staged but not deployed, waiting for a signal. Marcus asked 3 questions, all tactical, got 3 answers, and said he'd be in position within 90 minutes. He did not tell Cassian to be careful. They had known each other long enough to know that careful was a variable you managed, not a choice you made. Serena took the Escalade. Cassian gave her the keys without discussion because she needed the mobility and he would be stationary for the next 2 hours, and a man walking into a meeting he'd arranged did not need a vehicle. She took the keys, took the drive, took a handgun he produced from the farmhouse's storm cellar, a backup piece, 9mm, clean and loaded, and checked the magazine with the practiced ease of someone who had learned the skill in the years since she stopped being someone who didn't know how. That detail landed in him somewhere and stayed. The journalist, he said, can she move tonight? She's been ready to move for 4 years, Serena said. She just needed the files. When it transmits, when it's out there, it needs to be everywhere simultaneously, not one outlet, everywhere. She knows that. It's what she's been building toward. Serena pulled on a jacket she'd found in the farmhouse, dark, heavy, too large for her in the shoulders, and looked at him one last time. The kitchen light was bad, and the shadows fell across her face unevenly, and she looked tired in the way that went down to the bone, the kind of tired that a single night's sleep wouldn't touch, the kind that accumulated across years of sustained vigilance. She also looked, underneath all of that, absolutely determined. Don't let him monologue at you, she said. He'll want to explain everything. Don't give him the satisfaction. I'll try. She left. He listened to the Escalade's engine start in the barn, listened to it move out across the gravel and down the access road, and then there was nothing but the rain and the farmhouse and the particular quality of silence that preceded things that couldn't be undone. He called Adrian. The line picked up on the second ring. Of course it did. Adrian had been waiting. I'll meet you, Cassian said. 1 location, no armies. You bring 4 men, I bring 2. Neutral ground. You don't have neutral ground anymore, Adrian said. But he was interested. Cassian could hear it, the slight quickening beneath the controlled surface. Where did you have in mind? Cassian named a location he knew well. The Harwick shipping terminal on the eastern waterfront, an industrial facility currently between operational contracts and therefore empty. A place he had used 3 times over the years for exactly this kind of meeting. High ceilings, multiple entry points, enough ambient cover from the harbor noise to make acoustic surveillance difficult. Adrian would know it too. That was the point. Familiar ground reduced the objection surface. That's not neutral, Adrian said. That's yours. It was mine. Everything's shifting tonight. You said so yourself. Consider it transitional. A pause. Adrian was weighing it. The geometry, the risk, the possibility that this was a trap versus the possibility that Cassian Voss, cornered and out of options and facing fabricated evidence that would destroy him, was doing the rational thing and choosing a negotiated surrender over a futile last stand. Adrian believed Cassian knew in rational behavior. He had built his entire 8-year operation on the calculation that people under sufficient pressure defaulted to survival instinct over principle. He was not wrong about people in general. He was wrong about this person specifically, but he did not know that yet. 2 hours, Adrian said. Harwick Terminal, I'll bring 4. You bring whoever you have left. 2 hours, Cassian confirmed. He hung up and stood in the farmhouse kitchen for a moment, looking at the empty table where the drive had been. Then he put the secondary phone in his jacket pocket, checked the weapon at his hip, and walked out into the rain. The Harwick Terminal was 40 minutes from the farmhouse by the back roads, which gave him time to think, and not enough time to think too much, which was roughly the optimal condition. He drove a vehicle he'd found in the farmhouse barn, an old pickup, registered to the property's shell entity, nothing that tracked back to anything current, and he drove it at a steady speed through the rain-soaked darkness and thought about Adrian Mercer. He thought about the specific texture of a 15-year betrayal. Not the mechanics of it, he'd already run those, but the texture, the accumulated weight of it. Every meeting, every decision, every moment of what he had believed was shared investment in a common enterprise retroactively hollowed out. Adrian had been present for things that mattered, had been in the room for moments that were real. And the whole time, underneath the performance, there had been this other calculation running, patient, cold, oriented entirely toward the eventual moment of replacement. What Cassian felt about this was not, primarily, anger. He would have expected anger. What he felt was something closer to a profound disgust at his own capacity to be deceived, which was a harder thing to sit with than rage because it didn't have a clean external target. He had been fooled, thoroughly, by someone he had elevated and trusted and in some operational sense genuinely respected. That was on him in a way that nothing else about tonight was on him, and he carried it forward into the terminal as a reminder, not of weakness, but of the specific cost of misplaced certainty. The terminal was lit by the ambient glow of harbor lights and a row of industrial floods on the far wall that someone had left running, throwing long, flat shadows across the concrete floor. 2 enormous overhead cranes sat dormant above the central bay, their cables hanging in the still air. The rain hammered the metal roof in continuous waves. The smell was salt and old fuel, and the particular cold metal odor of industrial spaces that have been empty long enough to stop smelling like work. Cassian arrived 12 minutes before the arranged time. He walked the floor once, checking angles, exit points, the positions of cover, and then stood in the center of the main bay with his hands loose at his sides and waited. Adrian came through the eastern entrance at the 2-hour mark exactly. 4 men with him, as agreed, all armed, all professional. The kind of professional that came from specific backgrounds that Cassian recognized on sight. Not syndicate soldiers, private military. Adrian had been building his own force independent of the organization, drawing from the budget of the trafficking operation, and the 4 men moving into positions along the terminal wall moved with the discipline of people who were paid to be reliable rather than loyal. Adrian himself walked to the center of the floor and stopped 15 feet from Cassian and looked at him the way you looked at something you had been planning for a long time and were finally permitting yourself to examine directly. He looked almost exactly the same. That was the thing. 3 years, 8 years, all of it. And he looked like a man at a business meeting, composed, clean, that perpetual quality of steadiness that had always read as competence and was now readable as something colder. He was 51, lean, gray at the temples, dressed in dark civilian clothes that made no statement. He carried his weapon holstered, visible, not drawn. "No Marcus," he said, looking at Cassian's hands. "No backup." "I said 2. You said 2. You showed up alone." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "That's not like you. Tonight's not like anything." Adrian studied him. That studying look. Cassian had seen it 1,000 times across conference tables and operational briefings, and had always read it as the look of a careful thinker. It was that. It was also the look of a man who was continuously running a threat assessment on everyone in his environment, including Cassian, including tonight, and who would not lower his guard simply because Cassian had appeared to show up without support. "Where's the doctor?" Adrian said. "Safe." "Cassian, she's not part of this negotiation. She's the central part of it." Adrian's voice had not changed register. That steadiness that was not steadiness. "I've spent 3 years managing a considerable operational complexity specifically because of her continued existence. She doesn't get to be set aside. She knows what's on those documents. You already know she has copies. You've been watching the storage unit for 14 months. Cassian watched Adrian's face register this. A small adjustment, recalibration. Killing her doesn't solve it anymore, it just creates a different problem. And what does solve it? Give her a way out that doesn't require her silence, Cassian said. Let her go somewhere that isn't connected to any of this. She's a doctor. She wants to practice medicine. She doesn't want your operation. She wants to be left alone. She had 3 years to be left alone, and instead she accumulated evidence. She accumulated it defensively, because she believed her life depended on it. He kept his voice level, reasonable, channeling every resource he had into performing the negotiation rather than the confrontation. Behind all of it, he was watching the clock in his mind. Serena had said 2 hours. She needed 2 hours. He had been standing in this terminal for 11 minutes. Give her immunity from your network. Guarantee her safety in writing, backed by the political contacts who have more to lose than she does. She walks away. The documents become historical. No active threat. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He was listening too carefully. That was the tell. A man considering a genuine offer listened with a certain quality of openness, a slight softening around the decision-making process. Adrian was listening with the focused attention of someone cataloging information rather than weighing options. You're stalling, Adrian said. The temperature in the room changed. I'm negotiating, Cassian said. You're stalling. No heat in it, just the flat identification of a fact. She's running somewhere right now, with the drive. He took one step forward. I want to be clear with you about something, Cassian. I've admired you for a long time. That's not performance, it's true. What you built, the discipline of it, the consistency. I've spent 8 years studying how you think, and there's genuinely very little I'd have done differently in your position. Another step, which is why I need you to understand that I have already accounted for this. He raised one hand, not a weapon, a phone. He showed Cassian the screen. It was a live feed, grainy, clearly from a phone camera, held by someone in a moving vehicle. The footage showed a dark road, the interior of a car, and in the passenger seat, visible in 3/4 profile, Serena. She was in the Escalade. She was still driving, and someone was in the vehicle with her. Cassian's whole body went still in the way it went still before violence. Not frozen, just compressed. Every resource redirected toward the immediate problem, nothing leaking out anywhere. How, he said. The farmhouse. Adrian lowered the phone. I told you I knew about it. I've had a team on the property since you arrived. Your woman left 40 minutes ago with a driver she didn't know wasn't who he claimed to be. A pause. She's fine. She's going to stay fine as long as we resolve this quickly. He put the phone away. The drive, Cassian. And then we have a real conversation. The 4 men along the wall had shifted their positions. Subtly, but Cassian had been tracking them since they walked in, and the shift was unmistakable. Tightening, angles converging, not yet drawing, but ready. Cassian breathed. Slow, deliberate, the way he'd learned to breathe when the situation demanded that the body not betray what the mind was doing. Serena had been taken. The drive was with Serena. Adrian had known about the farmhouse, had positioned a team, had anticipated the plan with the specific precision of someone who understood how Cassian Voss thought, because he had spent 15 years watching him think. He had accounted for this. Maybe. Cassian moved his left hand into his jacket pocket. Adrian's 4 men went tight, hands to weapons, not drawing yet, watching. Cassian produced the secondary phone slowly, keeping the motion visible and non-threatening, and held it up between two fingers. "Before you finish this," he said, "you should know that I made a call 40 minutes ago. Not to Marcus, not to anyone in the organization." He kept his voice even. "There's a journalist. She's been working the trafficking beat for 4 years. She got a phone call tonight from a source with direct knowledge and corroborating documentation." He watched Adrian's face. "I don't need the drive, Adrian. Serena has a memory. She's been reading those documents for 3 years. The journalist has enough to start pulling threads. And once she starts pulling, the financial records exist in systems you can't touch." Something moved in Adrian's expression, the first thing that had moved since he walked in. "You're bluffing," he said. "I called while you were driving here. You can check the call log. This number, 42 minutes ago, duration 9 minutes. He held the phone out. "Check it." Adrian did not reach for the phone. He was running the calculation. Verify and lose 4 seconds of attention, or hold position and accept uncertainty. Either answer cost him something. "Even if that's true," Adrian said, "a journalist with secondhand information and no documentation gets the story out there, imperfectly, incompletely. And once it's out there, the political contacts you've been cultivating for 8 years start doing the calculation about whether protecting you costs more than cutting you loose." Cassian lowered the phone. "You built your protection on mutually assured discretion. The moment discretion becomes impossible, the mutually assured part collapses and everyone looks for an exit." He paused. "You know this. You're too smart not to know this." The rain on the roof was very loud. Somewhere in the terminal structure, a cable or chain was swinging in a draft, tapping against metal in an irregular rhythm. Adrian stood perfectly still. And in the stillness, Cassian saw something he had never seen in 15 years of reading this man's face. The very slight, very controlled appearance of a person recalculating from a position they had not expected to occupy. "Release Serena," Cassian said. "Let her go wherever she was going. Whatever she transmits, it's already in motion. Holding her doesn't stop it. It just adds a kidnapping charge to everything else." He held Adrian's gaze. "This is the version of tonight where you still have options. The other version starts in about 30 seconds. 30 seconds, Adrian said. "And what happens in 30 seconds? Cassian said nothing. He watched the second hand he was counting in his head, and he held Adrian's eyes, and he did not move. 15 years. The weight of it. The waste of it. "You were going to be the one who mattered," Cassian said quietly, and meant it, and the meaning of it came from a place that had nothing to do with strategy. "I built something real. You could have built something real inside it. Instead, you built this." Something in Adrian's face did a complicated thing. It passed quickly. "Sentiment," Adrian said, "at this particular moment." "Truth," Cassian said, "at this particular moment." The chain in the rafters tapped against metal. The rain drove against the roof. One of the 4 men along the wall shifted his weight, and the sound of it was very clear in the big empty space. Adrian raised 2 fingers, a signal, small, directed toward the eastern entrance. And then 3 things happened in approximately the same second. The lights in the terminal went out. The eastern entrance exploded inward with the focused violence of a battering ram hitting a steel door at speed. And Marcus's voice, very loud, from somewhere in the darkness above the main floor. "Nobody moves, nobody!" The 4 private military contractors along the wall made their calculation in under a second. Darkness, unknown number of opposing personnel, elevated position, no clear target, and made the rational choice, which was to hold rather than draw and die before they could identify a direction to shoot. Adrian made a different calculation. Cassian heard him move, 2 steps right, toward the secondary exit on the terminal's south wall, and went after him in the dark by sound, by memory of the floor layout he'd walked twice before Adrian arrived, by the specific animal focus that activated when everything else stripped away and left only the immediate physical fact of pursuit. He caught Adrian 8 feet from the south exit, hit him from the left side with his full weight, took them both into a metal shelving unit that went over with a crash that rang through the whole terminal. They hit the concrete floor hard, Cassian's shoulder taking the impact, pain spiking bright and immediate. And Adrian was fast, always had been, came up with an elbow that caught Cassian across the jaw with enough force to white out his vision for a half second. He grabbed Adrian's jacket instead of trying to see, pulled him down. They went over again, grappling in the dark on the concrete floor, and it was ugly and close and nothing like the choreographed violence of the movies. Just two men in the dark trying to establish control through grip strength and leverage and the willingness to absorb damage in exchange for position. Adrian got a hand to his holster. Cassian got a hand to Adrian's wrist before the weapon cleared. The gun went off once, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. The muzzle flashed strobing across Adrian's face for a fraction of a second, long enough for Cassian to see the expression there. Not fear, not fury, but a kind of furious concentration. A man doing arithmetic at speed, recalculating, still recalculating even now. The shot went wide, hit the wall somewhere. Marcus's people were moving through the terminal. Cassian could hear them, controlled and fast. The four contractors were being managed. The sounds from that direction were the specific sounds of a situation being brought under control by people who knew what they were doing. Here on the south wall floor, Cassian and Adrian were still deciding the smaller question. Cassian got his weight over Adrian's gun arm and applied pressure at the elbow until the weapon released and skittered across the concrete. Adrian drove a knee up, connected with Cassian's ribs, and the pain was real and present and did not matter. Cassian took the knee, shifted his weight, got a forearm across Adrian's throat, not crushing, just pinning, and put his face 12 inches from the face of the man who had spent 3 years letting him believe he was grieving a ghost. Adrian stopped moving. In the silence that followed, the lights came back on. Generator power, yellow and harsh. Adrian Mercer lay on the concrete floor of the Harwick terminal with a forearm across his throat and blood from a cut above his eye running down his temple and his gun 6 feet away, and Marcus standing 8 feet behind Cassian with a weapon leveled and 3 other men flanking. And he looked up at Cassian with those clear, assessing eyes and breathed with the controlled deliberation of a man who had not finished calculating yet. "The journalist," he said, slightly hoarse from the forearm at his throat. "You actually called her?" "Yes." "How much does she have?" "Enough." Cassian kept the forearm where it was. "Where is Serena?" Adrian's jaw worked. He was weighing. The last lever, the last piece of leverage, whether holding it bought him anything or whether the calculation had fully closed against him. Cassian watched him run it, watched the moment he arrived at the answer. "Route 7, Adrian said, 12 miles north. There's a service station closed. She'll be in the—" Cassian's phone went off, in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his ribs. He did not move the forearm. He looked at Marcus, and Marcus crossed and took the phone and looked at the screen and looked at Cassian with an expression that Cassian had not seen on Marcus's face in years. "It's her," Marcus said. "It's Serena." Cassian looked down at Adrian. "She got out," Adrian said quietly. It was not defeat in his voice. It was something more complex than defeat. The sound of a man who had spent 8 years accounting for every variable and had found, at the last, one he had underestimated. "She got out on her own." Cassian took the phone from Marcus and held it to his ear. "I'm out," Serena said. Her voice was steady and slightly breathless, and the most real sound he had heard in 3 years. "The driver made a mistake. I'm on Route 7 on foot, heading south, and Cassian—" A pause. "The file's transmitted 40 minutes ago. She has everything. It's already moving." The rain hammered the terminal roof. Adrian lay on the concrete below him, still breathing, still calculating with those clear eyes, looking up at the ceiling of a room that had just become the boundary of everything he had built over 8 years. And somewhere north on Route 7, in the rain, Serena Vale walked south with empty hands and a drive in her pocket, and a story already spreading through the channels that couldn't be closed. And Cassian held the phone against his ear long after Serena stopped talking, not because there was more to say, because the sound of her voice, steady, breathless, alive on a rain-soaked road 12 miles north, was something he needed another moment with before he put the phone down and stepped back into the machinery of what came next. He had not allowed himself to need things in 3 years. He was allowing himself this one. 10 seconds of standing in a terminal with a forearm still across a traitor's throat and the phone at his ear, and the specific relief of hearing a voice he had buried moving through him, like something that had been held underwater finally breaking the surface. Then he lowered the phone and looked at Marcus. "Route 7 north," he said. "Get her." Marcus was already moving, pulling a second man with him, heading for the eastern entrance. The remaining personnel had Adrian's 4 contractors secured. zip-tied, seated against the far wall, their weapons in a pile 8 feet away. Professional men in a professionally managed situation, resigned to the math of it. None of them were going to die for Adrian Mercer tonight. That was the difference between loyalty and employment, and Adrian had purchased employment. Cassian stood up from the floor. His shoulder was bad, not broken, but the joint had taken the shelving unit impact wrong and was telling him about it in the specific sustained language of deep bruising that would worsen over the next 12 hours before it started to improve. His jaw where Adrian's elbow had connected was swelling along the left side. He registered these facts and filed them under manageable and looked down at Adrian Mercer on the concrete floor. Adrian had not moved. He lay with one arm across his chest and the other flat at his side, and he looked at the ceiling of the Harwick terminal with the expression of a man doing a final accounting. Not panicked, not broken, just tallying, running the numbers on 8 years and arriving at the sum. "Get up," Cassian said. Adrian sat up slowly. The blood from the cut above his eye had tracked down to his jaw and dripped onto his collar. He looked at it briefly with a detachment that was either composure or shock, and then looked at Cassian. "The journalist," he said. "Which outlet?" "Independent, multiple simultaneous releases. She's been building a distribution network for 4 years. 4 years? Adrian absorbed this. "While I was watching the storage unit, while you were watching the wrong thing." Adrian nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone confirming a calculation error. Not theatrics, just accounting. "Reyes," he said. "She's already out of the country. She'll be—" "I don't care about Reyes tonight," Cassian said. "I care about you." Adrian looked at him. In the yellow generator light, his face was tired in a way that the controlled surface had been suppressing for some time. Cassian could see it now, the exhaustion underneath, the specific kind that came from maintaining a performance across years. He wondered if Adrian had ever had a conversation in the last 8 years that was not, on some level, performed. He wondered what that cost. Then he stopped wondering, because it wasn't his cost to carry. "What happens now?" Adrian said. "Now I call the federal contacts you didn't get to. I have more than one, and you overplayed the hand when you picked up the one you knew about. It told me how much you actually had access to and how much you thought you did." Cassian reached down and picked up Adrian's weapon from the floor, checked it, set it at the back of his waistband. "You're going to be processed through channels you spent 8 years trying to avoid. The documentation Serena has will corroborate what federal investigators have already been building from the outside. I know they've been building it because 3 months ago one of them made a quiet approach to one of my legitimate operations and asked questions that were specifically about the Eastern logistics chain. I didn't understand the questions at the time." "You understand them now?" "I understand them now." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The trafficking operation. The people currently in the system. In transit, in holding. There are 63 of them." He said it without emphasis, as statement. "You'll need the routing information to locate them. I'm the only one with the complete picture." Cassian looked at him for a long time. "You're offering to cooperate," he said. "I'm identifying leverage," Adrian said. "I still understand how this works." "So do I." Cassian crouched down to Adrian's eye level. A deliberate choice, face to face, no height differential. "Here's how it works. You give the routing information to federal investigators tonight. All of it. Every location, every handler, every transit point. Not as a negotiating position, as the only available option. Because if you don't, and those 63 people don't come home, that becomes the headline that follows your name forever. And a man who spent 8 years building political connections understands better than most what a headline like that does to a legacy." He held Adrian's gaze. "You're going to prison regardless. The question is what kind of man you are when you get there." Something moved in Adrian's eyes. Not remorse. Cassian did not think Adrian Mercer had the architecture for remorse. At least not the kind that looked at other people's suffering directly. But the calculation landed. The legacy calculation. The thing that mattered to a man who had spent 8 years constructing a version of himself he could be proud of, even if the construction had required monstrous materials. "All right," Adrian said. "All of it." "All of it." Cassian stood. He looked at the man on the floor for one more moment. 15 years of operational history. The weight of all those decisions made together, the collaborative intelligence that had built something real and been hollowed from the inside by something corrupt. And then he looked away. He was done looking at it. It would have to be processed eventually, probably for a long time, but not here and not tonight. He told the two remaining men to hold Adrian and wait for the federal contacts he was about to call. Then he walked to the eastern entrance of the Harwick terminal and pushed through the door into the rain. Marcus's car was coming south on Route 7 when Cassian reached the road. He could see the headlights a quarter mile out, moving at a pace that suggested no emergency, which meant she was in the vehicle and she was intact. He stood on the road shoulder in the rain with his jacket soaked through and his shoulder aching and his jaw swelling, and he watched the headlights come toward him. The car stopped. The passenger door opened. Serena got out. She was wet through, had been on foot in the rain for some time, her dark jacket plastered to her shoulders, her hair flattened. There was a bruise developing along her right cheekbone that hadn't been there at the farmhouse. Her hands were empty except for the USB drive she held in her right fist, which she had not let go of at any point, apparently, through whatever had happened in the vehicle on Route 7. She looked at him. He looked at her. The rain came down between them. "The driver," he said, "made the mistake of stopping to check his phone at a gas station on Route 7, she said. "I got out of the car while he was distracted, and I ran into the tree line. He didn't follow." She paused. "I think he underestimated how long I could run." "How long can you run?" "Apparently longer than he could be bothered to chase." She looked at the terminal behind him. The generator lights were visible through the high windows. "Adrian, cooperating federal contacts are on their way." She absorbed this. Her jaw worked slightly. He could see her processing it. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. The resolution of a 3-year threat was supposed to feel a particular way, and rarely did, in his experience, because the feeling you anticipated was clean, and the actual feeling was a complicated mixture of relief and the sudden absence of the adrenaline that had been holding you upright. "The journalist transmitted," she said. She confirmed. "It went to 11 outlets simultaneously, digital, print, broadcast. Some of it is already up." "I know." "Then it's done," she said. Not triumphant, just the statement of a fact. "It's done," he said. She stood in the rain and looked at him and then looked at the drive in her hand. She turned it over once, the scratched casing, the strip of tape. 3 years of carrying it. 3 years of it being the one thing that meant the situation was not entirely out of her control. She put it in her jacket pocket. "I need to sit down," she said. "Somewhere that isn't raining." "Yes," he said. "Okay." The weeks that followed were not clean. Cassian had known they wouldn't be, and he hadn't lied to himself about it, which was perhaps the only thing that made them navigable. Federal investigators came in force, 3 separate agencies, each with their own jurisdictional claims and institutional personalities, each requiring different modes of cooperation. Cassian spent 11 days in a sequence of interview rooms, with lawyers, without lawyers, going over the architecture of the organization's legitimate and illegitimate operations with the exhaustive specificity of a man who had decided to be done with the illegitimate half and was willing to demonstrate that decision through complete transparency. It was not comfortable. Several of those 11 days were actively unpleasant. He had built things that had hurt people, at remove and directly, and the accounting of it in a federal interview room had a quality that no amount of operational logic could fully insulate against. He did not try to insulate against it. He sat in the rooms and he answered the questions, and at the end of each day he went back to a hotel room in the city and ordered food he didn't particularly taste and slept more than he had in 3 years and woke up early and did it again. Adrian's cooperation on the trafficking routing information produced results within 72 hours. 47 of the 63 people were located and extracted from transit and holding points across 4 states and 2 international locations. 11 more were found over the following 2 weeks. 5 were not found, and that number lived in Cassian in a specific place that he would carry permanently. The investigators told him 5 out of 63 was an outcome. In the context of operations like this, that rarely happened. He understood what they meant, and it didn't help, and he didn't expect it to. The fabricated documentation Adrian had prepared, the material designed to position Cassian as the architect of the trafficking operation, collapsed under forensic analysis within days of Serena's files hitting the investigators' desks. The construction was sophisticated, but it had been built to deceive people who didn't have the original records to compare it against. And Serena's originals were devastating in their specificity. Transaction dates, routing codes, communication logs. The real records did not match the fabricated narrative, and the divergence was unambiguous. 3 of Adrian's political contacts retained lawyers within the first week. 2 more resigned from their positions without explanation. The Senate Oversight Committee member, the name Serena had recognized 3 years ago in the warehouse documents, became the subject of a separate federal investigation that would take 14 months to conclude. Reyes was found in a country without extradition, which was both expected and irrelevant. She had been peripheral to the core conspiracy, Adrian's instrument rather than his partner, and what she knew was already on record through multiple other sources. Cassian did not spend time on her. The organization contracted. This was deliberate and managed, a systematic unwinding of the operations that had no legitimate framework, a conversion of assets into structures that could function inside the law rather than around it. It took time, and it cost money, and several people who had been with the syndicate for years departed rather than navigate the transition. He let them go. The ones who stayed were either invested in the legitimate side of what he was building or had run their own private calculations and decided the direction made sense. Either motivation produced the same behavior, which was sufficient. Marcus stayed. Cassian had not asked him to and had not been surprised when he did. Some things did not require asking. Through all of this, Serena did not stay in Chicago. She had been clear about this from the night at the farmhouse, and she had not changed her position. She needed to go back to something real. Her words, spoken in the hotel lobby in the city during the second week, standing with her coat on and a bag over her shoulder and the specific posture of a woman who had made a decision and was not revisiting it, she needed to go back to medicine, to work. That meant something in the direct way that work could mean something when you were handing a person something they needed and seeing the result. Millhaven, he said, not Millhaven. She adjusted the strap of the bag. Too much happened there, too much that people will be curious about. A pause. But somewhere like it. You'll rebuild, he said. Not a question. That's what I do. She said it with the flat certainty of someone reporting a characteristic rather than making a claim. It was true. He had watched her do it. She had built a life under the worst possible conditions, in a situation designed to isolate and diminish her, and it had not isolated or diminished her. She had built a clinic and a practice and a community of people who needed her, and she had done it under a false name with a target she didn't fully understand on her back. Given actual freedom and actual resources, there was no version of events in which she failed to build something real. I'm going to dismantle the rest of the illegal operations, he said. It's going to take a year, maybe 18 months. And then, Cassian, I'm not asking you to wait. Good. She looked at him with those eyes that had always seen more than he offered. Because I'm not going to wait. I'm going to go somewhere and work and build something and live my life. She said this directly and without cruelty, which made it more honest than kind. And you're going to do what you have to do. And in a year or 18 months, or however long it takes for you to be someone who doesn't have to qualify every decision against what it costs the organization. She stopped. You know where I'll be. I don't, actually. You haven't told me. Something moved in her face, a small thing, quickly contained. No, she said. I haven't. She left. He stood in the lobby and watched her go and did not try to stop her because stopping her would have been the wrong thing to do, and he was trying, with considerable effort and intermittent success, to do the right things. He went back upstairs and ordered coffee and sat by the window and watched the city that he had built a significant portion of his adult life inside. And he thought about what it meant to dismantle something carefully versus letting it collapse. And he thought about the difference between the man he had been for the last 3 years and the man he had been before the fire. And he thought about whether either of those men was who he actually wanted to be, or whether those were just the versions that circumstance had produced. He thought for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called his lawyer and told him to begin the process. The year that followed was the most difficult sustained work of his life, and he had built an empire from the ground up in his 30s, so that was a statement with comparative weight. Dismantling was different from building. It required a constant negotiation between what was expedient and what was right, and the two rarely overlapped as cleanly as he would have preferred. There were days when the right answer cost more than he wanted to pay, and he paid it anyway because he had made a decision about what kind of accounting system he was going to operate on, and he was not going back. Marcus said, at one point during the 9th month, "You know you don't have to burn it all down. You could—" "Yes, I do," Cassian said. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Okay," he said, and that was the end of it. The legitimate operations expanded as the illegal ones wound down, a process that was not as paradoxical as it sounded, since the illegal operations had always been the minority by revenue, even if they'd been the organizational architecture that everything else hung on. The construction interests, the property portfolio, the logistics companies that ran actual freight, these had always been real, had always generated real employment and real economic activity in the neighborhoods where they operated. He put more into them. He hired people who had been through the justice system and found that a significant portion of them were extraordinarily good at their jobs, which surprised some of his remaining staff and did not surprise him at all. He started a fund. It had no name initially. The naming felt presumptuous, felt like a statement about legacy that he was not yet entitled to make. The fund channeled resources toward emergency medical infrastructure in underserved areas, rural clinics, equipment grants, operational support for programs like the one Serena had been part of in Millhaven, the outreach programs that put physicians in places where physicians did not ordinarily go. He did this without announcement and without publicity. And when one of his lawyers suggested a press strategy, he said no and meant it in the way he always meant things. In the 14th month, he received a letter, paper, hand-addressed, postmarked from a coastal town in a state he had not thought to look in. No return address. Inside, a single page. It said, "There's a clinic opening on the waterfront here in 3 weeks. It's small. It needs equipment it can't afford and a better building than it currently has. I'm not asking. I'm informing." No signature. The handwriting was hers. He had last seen it on a grocery list on a refrigerator in a kitchen that no longer existed, and he recognized it with the same certainty he had recognized her voice on a radio station nobody listened to, in a storm 14 months ago. He made 2 calls. The equipment arrived in 10 days. The building situation was resolved in a week. He did not travel to the town, did not send anyone to represent him, did not attach his name to any of it. The resources moved through the fund's channels and arrived without attribution, and he understood that was how she needed it to be. Not dependent, not indebted, not weighted with the complication of what they had been and what they might become. Just the work, just the clinic, just the thing that mattered. On the day of the clinic's opening, he knew the date because she had mentioned 3 weeks in the letter, and he had counted. He drove out of Chicago before sunrise and drove north along the lake road with the windows down and the morning coming in off the water, cold and clean and smelling of nothing except distance. He drove for 2 hours without destination and then pulled off at a state park overlook and sat on the hood of the car and watched the sun come fully up over the lake. He thought about a warehouse fire on a night 3 years gone, about a radio voice in a storm, about a grave with a name on it that was still, as far as he knew, standing in a Chicago cemetery. He had not yet decided what to do about the grave, whether removing it felt like erasure or whether leaving it felt like a lie. These were the kinds of problems that didn't have operational solutions, that just had to be lived with until clarity arrived or didn't. He thought about 63 people and the 5 he couldn't account for and the 47 he could, and he thought about the difference between penance and repair, and how repair was the only one of the two that produced anything that anyone could use. He thought about Serena, in a town he now knew the name of, standing outside a clinic on a waterfront on the morning of its opening, with patients coming in and work to do and a life she had built for the second time out of materials that were entirely her own. He did not call her. It was not time yet. But he sat on the hood of the car with the sun on the lake, and for the first time in more than 3 years, the thing inside his chest that had been running a permanent low-frequency alarm, the thing that had calibrated itself to the frequency of grief and had never fully switched off, was quiet. Not gone. He did not expect it to be gone, but quiet enough that he could sit still in the morning light without needing to be moving, without needing the speed and the empty highway to outrun it. He could just sit. He could just breathe. He could just watch the water. 5 months later, he drove to the coastal town. He did not announce it, and he did not plan beyond the driving, which took most of a day on back roads because back roads were still the habit, and some habits you kept because they served you in ways that had nothing to do with threat assessment. He arrived in the early evening when the light over the harbor was doing something gold and impractical, the kind of light that existed to embarrass people who had claimed not to notice it. The clinic was on the waterfront, as the letter had said. Modest scale, clean exterior, the kind of building that had been chosen for what it could do rather than what it looked like, with a sign that was readable from the sidewalk and lights on inside even at this hour. Through the front window he could see the tail end of activity, a day winding down, a staff moving through closing routines, the particular organized energy of a place that had been fully used and would be ready to be used again tomorrow. He stood on the sidewalk across the street and watched it for a while. She came out the front door at 6:20. She was talking to someone behind her, a young woman, medical staff by the look of her, listening with the attentiveness of someone who was still learning and knew it. Serena had a jacket on against the evening cold, and her hair back and the white coat traded for civilian clothes, and she was mid-sentence about something clinical, specific, her hand sketching a shape in the air that probably corresponded to an anatomical structure he would never be able to identify. She finished the sentence. The young woman nodded, went back inside. Serena turned toward the harbor. Across the street, she found him standing on the sidewalk. She did not run. She did not go white. She looked at him with those eyes, and he looked back, and the harbor was there behind her, the boats and the water and the impractical gold light making its embarrassing best effort, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment didn't require it. Then she tilted her head slightly. The gesture he recognized from 7 years ago in a hospital waiting room, the one that meant she was deciding something. "You look better," she said, "than the last time I saw you. You didn't see me at my best that night." No. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The possibility of one. "The equipment you sent, the building. The fund handles that kind of thing." "The fund," she said. "It doesn't have a name yet." She looked at him for a moment. 47, she said. "I read the final report." "And 5. And 5. She held his gaze. "You're still carrying the 5. "Yes." "You will for a while." "I know." She nodded, looked at the harbor briefly, then back at him. "Are you hungry?" she said. "There's a place 2 blocks from here that's not remarkable, but it's honest." "Yeah," he said, "I'm hungry." They walked the 2 blocks without performance, not touching, not explaining themselves to the evening or to each other, just 2 people walking a familiar distance in a direction they had both, separately and for different reasons, been moving toward for a long time. The light off the harbor followed them for a block and then didn't, and the town settled into its evening around them, ordinary and indifferent and entirely real. At the door of the restaurant she stopped and looked at him once more, with the last of the gold light catching the side of her face, and there was something in her expression that was neither the woman who had fled a fire nor the woman who had survived the years after, but something that was becoming, slowly, honestly, without shortcuts, whatever came next. "I'm not the same," she said. "You need to know that." "Neither am I," he said. She considered this, found it sufficient, pushed open the door. He followed her inside.